Well, welcome everyone. Now we have the panel fully assembled. So my name's Dan Perrins. I'm from the Johnson Shama Graduate School of Public Policy, and I see many faces out there I haven't seen for a while. So welcome to the panel on public engagement and the significance of public engagement. I think has made the news on many occasions of late, and I think it continues to be probably one of the most critical issues, and has only been highlighted again by recent events in Japan. So it's a pleasure to welcome the panelists. Each panel member will present for 20 minutes. I have a 3-minute warning, I have a 1-minute warning, and then I get up and knock them off their chair. No, I won't really. Just a stern reminder, because there's 30 minutes for questions, and we want to make sure that people have plenty of opportunity to engage in dialogue and conversation. So we're going to proceed from my left, and it's a pleasure to welcome Chris Decker, and following Chris will be Linda Keane, and then finally Florian Kern. So, Chris.
Well, thank you, Dan, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be part of the panel here this morning. To my colleagues on the panel, welcome. It's a great pleasure to share the stage with you. When Dan phoned me several weeks ago and asked me to join the panel, we immediately started to reminisce about the time we spent one long, hot, early summer, not that short a time ago. And that was the Future of Uranium in Saskatchewan public consultation process, which was an extensive and comprehensive initiative. We had online opportunities to participate. We had written submissions. There was an extensive 4-day one-on-one stakeholder consultation. There were 10 town hall meetings, a tour of northern communities, and the list went on. In all, about 2,300 submissions and representations, just over that, I think it was, for that particular process. And one of the recommendations, when Dan sifted through all of the data and came up with findings and some recommendations, I want to read to you. It says, we need more and better information. Recommend that forums to be organized on an ongoing basis to facilitate dialogue, debate, publicize, and publications of information dissemination through the media. This should include, but not be limited to, the hosting of conferences by the Government of Saskatchewan and the 2 universities. So you can see Dan's fingerprints on today's forum. And so I would like to congratulate him for taking his own advice and moving forward with forums such as this, and also for his great work on the future of uranium in Saskatchewan. And having seen him at work, yes, he will grab us after 2, 3 minutes and 1 minute and take us off the stage. So we'll run this like clockwork, I'm quite sure. I've been involved in public engagement most of my working career. I started at the University of Saskatchewan College of Commerce. I was a marketing major, and of course you study consumer behavior, market research, quantitative analysis. From there I was a market research analyst with the Local Economic Development Assistance Authority out of North Battleford, where we did numerous secondary and primary research for industry and for business. On into the City of Saskatoon as Public Affairs, Intergovernmental Relations Director, Manager of Marketing and Communications, and also Project Manager for River Landing Development. And in each step, there's extensive public engagement, public opinion garnering, and decision-making on each one of those. So in the limited amount of time that I have today, I wanted to leave you with just a couple of points that will hopefully engage discussion a little bit later on. And that is that there is a delicious irony in the art of science of public opinion and decision-making. And that is very simply, the more complex the issue, the more important it is to get public opinion, but the more inaccurate and difficult it is to get. And to say that integrated energy policy is a complex issue would be an understatement. This particular area covers lots of different issues. And these are just a short list, quite frankly, of what integrated policy would touch. It's an economic development issue. This area covers billions of dollars of potential investment and the jobs that go with them. These are critically important for the province and for the communities where they are certainly, where those jobs are. It's about competitive taxes and government revenues. The government is the sole producer of power and distribution of power. They get the revenues from that, but they also get the revenues from royalties from oil and gas and from uranium. Some would say environment is the only issue that should be discussed around such topics as integrated energy policy. It's about energy security. It's about international relations and trade. It's about cost to consumers. If there ever was an issue where the rubber hits the road or where the wallet gets hit, it's in the area of the cost to consumers. And I'm talking residential and also business and industry, because there's many industries and many businesses where their inputs, particularly in their area of power, is one of their most heavy costs. Then there's politics, partisan politics. Now, I know what you're thinking, not in Saskatchewan, that can't be. But it is, of course, inextricably intertwined into this complex issue. So when it gets complex like that, you can't get a yes or no out of this issue, and I think you know that. There are just too many things to consider, too many issues that permeate, and it's too complicated. We're not going to do you understand and do you support an integrated policy development in the province of Saskatchewan? Yes or no? Well, it's not going to happen. It's far more complicated than that. So let's look at the tools that we typically use when we engage public opinion, when we engage the public. And I divided these two into two areas. One is qualitative, the other one is quantitative, which I'll talk about in just a moment. The qualitative tool in the toolbox is about getting the issues, finding out what the issues are, finding where people stand on the issues, asking questions, finding out what the questions are on these issues. And you do these things like through public meetings, and that has a variation of themes. You have town halls. That's your typical situation where you have your representatives, your officials, your experts on a stage. They typically give a presentation, and then you open it up to the audience who are sitting out there for questions and answers and input. You have an open house, which is a little more informal. That's a situation where you have a room like this, and there's different stages and areas of the room where the public are allowed to come in. It's a come and go situation. They can go to stage number 1, talk to an expert, look at display panels, go to the next one, skip that one, go over to the one over there that they might want to talk about and to ask questions. There's typically a questionnaire at the end, and that's the end of the program. And then there are forums like this, and I won't go into any of the details that surround a forum. Focus groups are a formal meeting. You're getting a little bit more formal in that the group is typically sampled at random, and there is a template by which each of the groups are given questions, and input is garnered back. There's stakeholder consultations. This is targeted toward either industry or advocacy groups. There's written submissions, as I mentioned, that we engendered during the Future of Uranium in Saskatchewan. And then there's this one at the bottom, coffee row and phone calls. It's certainly the most informal, but don't underestimate the power on decision makers on this informal qualitative tool in the toolbox, because decision makers are phoned and lobbied all the time. When I was with City Council, for instance, there would be many City Council meetings where a councillor would stand up on a particular issue and say, I have been flooded by phone calls on this. And the next one would stand up and he would say, I've been inundated with phone calls. And we did the calculus on that and found that flooded was 4 phone calls and inundated was 5, typically. In the quantitative toolbox, these are your typical tools. Survey, number 1. Here's where you start to get into a little bit more reliable data, and be careful how I say this because I'm going to get into this a little bit later. It's certainly more there's method to it, there's scientific approach. You get numbers, you can apply analysis to those numbers, quantitative analysis. You can cross-tab, you get levels of significance, level of confidence. This is more scientific than the others, but it too is fraught with peril that I'll just get into in a moment. The other 3 referenda, plebiscites, and elections are quantitative, but they're immediately actionable. In a survey, you may get opinions and you may get information. You pass that on to the decision maker, and they make a decision. Those other 3, the decision is the survey. So you get a plebiscite or referenda, and they say X, then X will happen. Same thing with elections, but it's at a broader level, obviously. If you don't like the government policies on ballots, then you vote them out or you vote another one in. But there is still fraught with peril as you go into the survey world. And I don't know if you all can read this cartoon, but the poor guy at the bar is a pollster, and he's tired of being lied to day after day after day. Marriage troubles? No, I'm a pollster. The reason why is that even surveys can be inaccurate. Depends on many different things and many different parts of a survey that can go wrong. Sometimes, in fairness, it's sometimes purposeful, but they're not as accurate as you hope they were. In fact, I'm going to just read very quickly from some information, some academic information that came from John Zoller and Stanley Feldman, who did some great research on the simple theories and survey responses and what peril you can get into in surveying. Because measuring public opinion has issues, be it a bias based on the questions being asked or framed. Once past this set of problems, there's a much larger question that needs to be resolved. Do people know what they want? And if they do they understand the trade-offs that need to be made? They're arguing that the same person, in the survey that they did, the same person can answer the same question at different times as if it involved different topics. This shows that people may not even understand the questions that are being asked. They contend that if a person does understand the question, their answer may differ based on the interpretation of the question on any given day, which could be influenced by numerous factors. In fact, it could mean that the public just does not know what they want, and that is why the given answer is depending on the situation at hand. So again, the complicated issues are seldom black and white. They're seldom yes or no. They involve trade-offs. If I asked you if you wanted to buy my car, yes or no? Well, you're going to want some more information, right? You're going to want to know how much, what kind of a car, what shape is it in. You need more information in order to answer that simple yes or no. There are trade-offs involved in asking that particular opinion question. So they say one cannot believe that government expenditures should be increased, that government revenues should be decreased, and that the balanced budgets should be achieved all at the same time. But research shows that people do. They want it all. So the most negative evaluation of these findings, you could come to two conclusions. The public may or may not know what they really want, and regardless of if the public knows what they want, public opinion research may or may not properly reflect the general will, and thus acting on it may not be in the public's interest. Well, this kind of sums it up. This is a public opinion poll on public opinion. Do you trust public opinion? 76% of the people said no, 19% said yes, and 5% said what? I'm trusting the 5% more than anything. Now, I want to also show you some leading luminaries, certainly not necessarily in the field of public engagement, but some pretty smart people in our past. This is Bertrand Russell, who said one should respect public opinion insofar as is necessary to avoid starvation and keep out of prison, but anything beyond that is submission to an unnecessary tyranny. This is everybody's favorite French playwright from the 17th century, Sebastian Roch-Nicolas de Chamfort. There are certain times when public opinion is the worst of all opinions. Oscar Wilde defined public opinion, an attempt to organize the ignorance of the community and to elevate it to the dignity of physical force. Now, before you think I'm dead set against public opinion and public engagement, let me switch to something else that somebody else said a long time ago, and I think absolutely nailed it. This is the German philosopher George Hegel. Public opinion contains all kinds of falsity and truth, but it takes a great man to find the truth in it. And that's our role. We have to engage the public. We have to do it in many different ways, but it's up to people like myself, people like Dan Perrins, to understand the nuances and the issues in public engagement and in public opinion, then give that information to decision makers so that they can make the best decision on our behalf. So, in closing, how do we do this right? Well, like communication, public engagement is two-way. You need to educate and inform. You need to tell them what that car is, how much it is, what it's like, what condition it is in, before they can give you the correct answer back. This, too, is fraught with peril, because there's a fine line in some people's minds between educated and informing and propaganda. All right? You're telling me what to think. There's a fine line there. We still need to use multiple public engagement platforms, all the tools in the toolbox. Get it from every way you can, qualitative and quantitative. Do public meetings along with survey, because you get two different results, and sometimes you need to get it from those different sources. But understand their limitations. Know that when you go into a public meeting and a public forum, there's a chance that stakeholder groups might take over that meeting and dominate it. And John and Jake, who public in the back, may not get an opportunity to stand up and say what they want to say. How to get that opinion is through survey. So you need to use all of the public engagement platforms and understand their limitations. And finally, again, as I had noted, public engagement is a tool for decision makers. Other than those quantitative tools, elections, plebiscite, and referenda, where it immediately leads to action, everything else is information for decision makers. You put a report in for cabinet, you put a report in for city council, you put a report in for your board members, and they make that decision based on the information that you give them as to how the public was engaged and indeed what their opinions are. So as it relates back to our issue at hand, which is, of course, integrated policy on energy, I found this from the Canadian Council of CEOs. They did a document called Clean Growth 2.0, and I think they framed this very nicely. We need to move the national discussion beyond debates about the environmental impact of specific energy choices to a balanced and informed discussion of Canada's energy future and the role individual Canadians must play. All forms of energy will be required to meet current and future needs, and all have some environmental impact and costs and are sure to increase. Those are the trade-offs that we need to put in front of the citizens of Canada as we explore an integrated policy for Saskatchewan. Thank you very much. We look forward to the discussion and the questions.
Thank you, Chris. Linda?
Right and left. Right to.
Anyone who knows me, Linda just asked me how that thing works. So,
well, thanks very much, and I again look forward to the conversation afterwards as much as the presentation that I'm going to give you today. I think that this is really a wonderful opportunity, and I'd like to thank Dan and the school and the government of Saskatchewan for engaging in this. I mentioned to a few people that I was in university in Alberta at the time that the Lougheed government came in, and at that time there was this openness towards policy discussions and getting policy ideas. And I think this is, we talked about windows earlier today, and this is a window too, where there's openness to thought and ideas, and I think all of the people in this room have an opportunity to use this openness to help formulate this integrated energy policy. So it's a real window at this time, and I'm proud to be part of it. The reason I titled this was Energy by the People, for the People, is because this, as we talked about this morning, is really a resource of Saskatchewan. And the issue will be that they will be involved. They're going to be the laborers. They're going to be the financiers of this. And the real issue is, will they feel that this energy resource, the policy that comes out of it, is for their benefit or not? And I think that that is going to be one of the final questions, I think, as well as the initial thoughts. I like to take apart titles a little bit and see what people are trying to do here. And I think it's really interesting. We're going to talk about public confidence and engagement, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. But when you talk about the title of this day, you're talking about taking charge. And that means that there's a commitment to getting something done, not just more talk, and less walk. So taking charge means that there's a commitment to action, and that's one of the judgment calls that are made about this. And then, will there be an integrated policy action at the end? Will there be a policy? If you Google Saskatchewan energy policy, you will be referred to a year-old Department of Natural Resources document, and you'll be referred to a set of policy work that was done by the Council for Policy Alternatives, a 3-part policy work that's been done. But you're not going to see in much that says, gee, if I was a citizen and I was Googling, where would I end up? What would I really see in terms of an energy policy? So one has to say that it was really interesting to hear the deputy and the minister today, but if you were a Saskatchewan resident, you wouldn't exactly hear that. You wouldn't really be knowing where that was going. And integrated mean there's lots of inputs into it. I just put this up to say that what we heard today, the complexity of sources of energy and what you're talking about, it's not going to be easy from that point of view either. I put this up because the topic today is citizens, but really most of the work that I do, it talks about stakeholders. And defining exactly who the stakeholders are is a very important and important step in this, to know exactly who is in the interested parties. It's, I think, a little bit better in French than it is in English, but that's exactly who is involved. And I put down some of them, but acknowledging that the government of Saskatchewan, as Chris has said, has got a huge responsibility in this. This is provincial jurisdiction, and you got to get on with it and make those decisions. Some would put media in here, but I didn't necessarily, but I think you could extend this. But defining who the stakeholders are and having a respectful dialogue with all these people is an incredibly important part of this whole thing. I put Aboriginal people separately because for those of you who understand the fiduciary responsibility towards First Nations, as an ex-regulator, I sure and heck understood that. And they do not consider themselves in any of those other areas, and they require a separate consideration. So citizens expect to be engaged and expect to have confidence in their government. Obvious, self-evident, but do they? Now, when we talk about energy policy, do they have those views? Do they feel that they're being engaged, and do they have confidence? And at the end of this process and the continuous discussion of energy, will they feel that? That's one of the judgments we'll have to make. Values. Chris and I have a little bit of shared past because one part of my master's studies was work done on market research about agriculture and agri-food, moving to an agri-food policy in Alberta. And we did a lot of research, first of all, to understand what were some of the values and attitudes before you start marching into asking them what they think about those. So this is by no means based on anything about focus groups, but really understanding people's value systems about what they expect, not in the energy policy, but in how you do this. So they were talking now about how you actually engage people. And that I think this is all for debate as to whether these are the list or there's another list or a different list, but I think that this is something that has to be discussed, is what would they expect in terms of transparency, feedback, accurate, unbiased, timely information, etc. Certainly ethics comes into many of the discussions that I've been having. One of the jobs that I have now that I kind of fell into is advising multi-billion-dollar hedge funds in terms of their investments in looking at mining opportunities in parts of the world. And I make those companies go through a dance, if I can put it that way, of talking about these issues before we get into finding out whether these communities are receptive to mining operations or not. I'm going to go just quickly through two slides. First of all, what engagement means, and then what confidence means. So all of these words, consultation, influence, sharing, listening, information, which is usually a one-way channel, are all being used to mean consultation. And the truth probably is somewhere in the middle, that it involves a lot of these. But what I think that we have to say is that considering all the advantages we have in this country in terms of education and various ways of transmitting and receiving information, we do a pretty poor job. of actually having ongoing consultation and meaningful consultation on this process. I just got back from a series of discussions that I had in Quebec, and this started, my daughter-in-law is on the city council of the city of Saint-Hilaire, which is a bedroom community outside of Montreal. And their city council was being asked to endorse shale gas exploration. Well, if any of you have watched what's happened in Quebec, all the predictions were wrong. That the Quebec citizen has slammed this so badly that it's probably put back 2 or 3 decades. This is an example of absolute misreading of the Quebec citizens in terms of where they were coming from and what they wanted to do. And so it was a very interesting process for me to watch. Confidence, again, these are just words that could be elaborated on or whatever. But when you talk about confidence, what is your standard? What would mean that the citizens here really have confidence in their government on this? What would they expect, and how would be those measures? Keen's rules of engagement. This is just for fun, and probably statements that could be beaten up. You don't have the solutions they do. If you go out there with a preconceived idea that they would like A or B, or that A or B are mutually exclusive, or that they can't understand complexity, or that they do understand complexity, all of that is based on you putting on them what you think is the idea. And second is you can't over-communicate, or being upfront beats backing down. This morning I went onto the Globe and Mail site and saw an article about Bruce Power. For those of you that may have watched this, Bruce Power has sought to move some generator parts through the Great Lakes for recycling. And they got the sign-off of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. This morning, Bruce Power says that they're not going to do this till they get a chance to talk more to all those stakeholders that were upset about this process. Boy, is that the cart really before the horse, or after the horse, or whatever. This should have been done way before they ended up with this controversy. Putting that, as I said, putting the genie back in the bottle is really hard once you've got it out there. And it's got implications not just for Bruce Power, but for other people now who are trying to move anything through the Great Lakes and whatever. And Bruce Power's relationship with the First Nation, which was very good, actually, up until this last part. So you can't really it's very difficult to put the genie in the bottle, so plan. Tomorrow's risks are today's homework. One of the things I do is a lot of work in integrated risk management, which is a kind of a nice phrase for what is really a very difficult process of deciding what are all the possible risks together. And for any of you that have read the issues around the black swans, and in fact part of the issue about the Japanese reactor was a tendency for us to look at one risk versus another in doing operations, and to not do a broad understanding of the possible risks. You need to have a few negative people on your group, and I say that because I'm a real optimist, but you need to have those people say, you know what could happen? You could have X, Y, and Z altogether. I had a little example of this when I was this Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, because we had a blackout. And I was away. I was down visiting the Port Hope facility of Camco that day, and never thought that the cell phone didn't work. So, of course, I didn't get any notice. My staff were at the various nuclear facilities, and there was some discussion at that time that perhaps it was based on cybersecurity issues, but it wasn't. But meanwhile, the power went out in the facility that I ran in Ottawa. So no power at the facilities, no cell phones. The pumps on the gas pumps wouldn't work, and my facility was down. and Ottawa. So right after that, I thought, you know what, we've got to do a better job of looking at this. So now we have, the CNSC now has a generator on top of its building. And maybe even that is looking at yesterday's problems, not today's. But looking at risk management in terms of tomorrow's risks, and we talk about putting all your eggs in one energy basket and then finding out that that is no longer suitable for a whole bunch of reasons. And it could be for positive reasons. Maybe the costs of solar panels have decreased. Maybe all the stuff we heard earlier today is not true. Maybe there's a breakthrough tomorrow and there's wonderful opportunities. Maybe we solve a lot of the issues to do with geology of geothermal tomorrow, and it becomes an opportunity. So integrated risk management could be you haven't thought of the opportunities as much as the risks, and here you're building a $3 billion nuclear facility, and you've committed yourself to one direction versus another. This is just I guess to say that there's this continuous discussion, continuous, and I think if there's one fault of a lot of the engagements that I've seen is it's done at the beginning and then they drop it, done middle way through and not at the end, but it's a continuous investment. Ways to fail. Talk integrated but deliver narrow. I'm sorry, a lot of the discussions so far have been on specific little areas, and I haven't heard too much talk about what is all of the options on the table for energy policy, and what do we go for here? It would be interesting to have someone talk about everything on the table in terms of biomass, shale. I don't know if any of those areas are pertinent geothermal, but rather than talking about nuclear alone or talking about coal, what really are those options? What are the total options, and what might be your option if you live in L'Orange versus if you live in Lloyd? And I think that some of this, I have a sense that quite often we dumb down to people, talking down to people, and that definitely is an issue. Lump everyone together. I talked a little bit about the First Nations people, but I think there's a lot of discussions, both geographical and other ways, where you would split the population into other ways of looking at things rather than just geography or age or whatever. Burial by bureaucracy. I think that turning it over to people who are very much in an institutional setting may not be a popular thing for me to say here, but I think there's opportunities to engage more people in the community than just the bureaucracy, and to get people involved who are interested. And the last is stop and start engagement. Let's get all excited about this. Let's consult and try to engage people, and then let's forget it afterwards. This is my cartoon. This is a cartoon about should we continue to manage the issues, or should I align organizational activities with stakeholder expectations? That's bureaucracy. I said, which answer would cause you to do real work? And then he said, what is this, a farm? Since I come from a farm in Alberta, I thought, well, yeah. So people who are in charge of stakeholder communication sometimes don't really want to do it. It's, oh, shoot. So get people involved, probably people outside the communications profession who really are able to have the engagement themselves and the enthusiasm. I guess I'm going to talk now, and this is the one that I'm going to talk about the most, is maybe some suggestions about doing it differently. And again, I think this is extremely exciting that the government of Saskatchewan has asked the school to do some work on this and to engage and to bring all these people from across Canada and across the world to give some advice. So maybe the next steps are obvious, but maybe they aren't. The first thing is, it was interesting to hear the minister today say that it's disaggregated in terms of responsibility for this. But I think that if one of the possible ideas is if you, I mean, energy is really important to Saskatchewan. This is not just one possibility. This is a major, major opportunity to do all the things that Chris mentioned earlier in terms of economic development, innovation, looking at the prosperity, helping people in terms of royalties. It's got so much opportunity, energy efficiency, really putting yourself on the map in terms of climate change and efficiency and moving ahead. As costs go up in this province, you know, people are going to have to find other ways to save money, and so there's just so much opportunity. So to me, I think some thought should be given about making this a big deal, making this some kind of a task force that really looks at this and starts out with a kind of an openness and having someone at the end who hasn't declared their pro or con in the energy area that that will take the time necessary. Time can be the enemy or your strength. But I think timing is very important. It's important to get that window, but it's also important to listen and engage people appropriately. And I think we've all seen examples where people are trying to engage too fast. You know, we'll do 7 round tables around the province, and boy, we're making a decision by 2 weeks from now, and away you go. So finding some kind of a balance between getting a result and losing the momentum, but getting on with it, but taking it to the top and using new media. I have 5 stepsons, and not one of them pays attention to the television or to the newspaper, and yet they're all engaged in what's happening, and it is all to do with new media. And so I think anyone under the age of 30 is probably we're talking about in the election, is paying more attention. So I would hope that if somebody Googled energy policy in Saskatchewan in 6 months from now, they wouldn't find a year-old outdated report from the energy ministry, and that they would find a site to tell them exactly what's going on, what are the background, what is the data, what are the issues, and by goodness, how do I get engaged? And I don't have to go to a stakeholder meeting that's happening at 2 o'clock in a town 50 miles from now. I can engage now. I can engage, and I know how to engage, and I can get feedback on my engagement. That it doesn't go into a black hole of Calcutta, and I really know that it's been recorded, that my opinion's been recorded, and that I have an opportunity to get engaged and to be involved. I don't think that means that people expect that you're going to turn everything around the other way, but I think it is really engaged. Imagine energy for the next generation. Boy, this is exciting. This is a vision. This isn't something that's dealt with in a short run. Hunt down the risks that you've got and figure out what those risks are, that you invest in something that's base load when what you need is something that's more intermittent. Put energy into education. Get into start by really talking about energy in the schools and have an opportunity, again, the same kind of objective information to say that there's many sources of energy and how it would work. Drive with a dashboard. I'm kind of a big believer as a Harvard type that you get a dashboard of indicators and you say based on those values of people, how you're going to do things and what you're going to do, and drive towards a dashboard that says this is the kind of energy policy we want, and this is what it'll have to do to meet the needs of the citizens of Saskatchewan. So engaging in a way that people really have a sense that you have a direction, but that you're open to change, and so you don't come out with pronouncements in advance. So that's my presentation, and as Chris said, I'm very much interested in talking with you about some of the ideas and that you may have on this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Linda. Gloria?
my colleagues have been very good at keeping to time, so I'm trying to follow up on this good example. Let me start by saying thank you to the organizers of this meeting, and especially Jeremy Rayner. It's a pleasure to be here. This is actually my first time in Canada and my first time in Saskatchewan. And I've learned a great deal about Canada, about Canadian politics, the provinces, and Saskatchewan. And it's been fascinating for me so far. And yeah, I'm looking forward to engaging more with you throughout the day. I'm from the UK, and so people ask, well, why is this guy here? If anyone asks that question, then please ask Jeremy. No, obviously, I mean, these kinds of challenges are the same in a lot of different countries, and I think there's a great value in sharing expertises and lessons learned from different jurisdictions. So I'm based at the University of Sussex at SPRU. I'm part of the largest research group at this institution. It's the Energy Group, and I think it's fair to say we are about 30 people overall, and therefore we're one of the biggest independent energy policy research groups in the world. There's a long tradition of working on energy policy issues in the institution. We've been working on this topic for about 30 years. We have funding from a number of public bodies, public research funders, as well as industry and NGOs. We are believing in the value of research that is problem-focused, so we have an interdisciplinary approach. Some of my colleagues are economists. I have a background in policy analysis, political science, and we have colleagues with a background in innovation studies and knowing about technology policies, for example. We do work mainly on the UK as well as other European countries. I myself have done work on the Netherlands, Denmark, Germany, and of course this is the energy challenge of the future is also a global challenge, so we're also looking towards India and China in particular in terms of technology transfer, for example, as well as international climate policy. But overall, the whole group has been set up and has had funding for 6 years to investigate this question of how are we going to get to our current energy system to something that is more sustainable? How do we get there? How do we govern this long-term process? Okay, so this is the outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'll quickly say a few words about why do we need public engagement, and my two colleagues have already stated some of these things, but I think I have some other points as well. And then I'll quickly talk about two empirical examples from Europe, not because they're particularly good examples for public engagement. Some are rather about what can go wrong, but I think they're very important in terms of what we can learn from them on how to do public engagement well. But by the way, I'm from Germany originally, so I'm totally neutral in this, so I don't have to promote either of these approaches. So why is public acceptance important in energy policy? And of course you could argue, well, public acceptance is important across the board in all sorts of policy areas, but I think energy has a number of features that are particular to the energy sector and that make public acceptance issues particularly important. So one is that the energy sector has very high R&D as well as investment costs. So that has brought the public purse into the equation most of the time. The energy sector is either publicly owned, as I learned, most in Canada, or if it's not, if it's a liberalized sector, then at least it's very heavily regulated. Well, obviously, energy production and use has a lot of environmental impacts. So there's issues of acid rain, nuclear waste, climate change, but also water pollution, for example, from mining operation and so on. And it is important that we've been talking this morning about different goals for energy policy, and I think they are very important and political trade-offs between different energy policy goals. And there's no easy way of coming up with an optimal policy. So if the substance is political, then we need public engagement, is the argument. And I think if we're talking in particular about transitions towards something that is more sustainable, obviously sustainable development is a contested concept, as we've discussed this morning with James, and the choices we're making. We were talking earlier about putting all the options on the tables and what they are, and I think a lot of that is not just about economics or whether the technology works. Essentially, it's the normative questions that are embedded in this, and therefore the choices are political. And just one recent case where we can see these days is in the building of new coal-fired power stations and the public backlash against that. So this is a picture from the US, and there have been backlashes against building new coal-fired power plants. We've seen the same thing in the UK with the Kingsnorth plant. This utility abandoned the plan to build a new coal-fired power plant because of public opposition. We see the same thing in Germany at the moment. So what I'm saying is energy policy is very political. Just looking through a number of policy documents, you always find that policymakers at least talk the talk of public engagement and the public playing an important role. But I think it's important to stress that they think of the public and what we need to do in quite different ways. And let's take one of the statements from the UK. So this is Charles Hendry. He's our energy minister at the moment. And this is in the context of renewable energy deployment. And he says, well, we have to carry people with us in this process. If it's too top-down, then people will react against renewable deployment. There's huge public acceptability issues in the UK, for example, with regard to onshore wind. People don't like them because of the visual impact, because of noise, impact on birds, and so on. So there's a huge challenge there. The second one is from the Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs, and they have a different take on this. They're talking about, well, realizing a sustainable energy system requires consumers, companies, governments, and agencies to change their ways of thinking and acting. So this is about people playing a different role. It's not just whether they accept the wind turbine near their house or they don't. It's about they have to change their lifestyle. They have to be active in this process. And sorry, should have put that up earlier. And then the last quote is from a recent International Energy Agency report on Canada's energy policy, where it talks about public acceptance of CCS, and that is a challenge, and that we need public engagement and education. As we talked earlier, information is important on CCS, and that also requires resources. So again, another take on, well, this is more sort of information provision for people to understand that this is necessary, or what the risks are, or how serious the risks are. So in policy documents, we find that this kind of rhetoric a lot, that somehow people need to be involved, but no one is quite sure in what way and for what reasons. And so what colleagues have done is to think through what are the three sort of distinct rationales for public engagement in energy policy. And so I think the first one is a normative reason. And this is sort of the democratic legitimacy is essential, and political scientists talk about input legitimacy, so people being able to influence processes, having a say. And people argue that whether that is economically efficient or so on is irrespective. This is a normative issue. It's the right thing to do in a democratic societies, and also that policies need to be acceptable to the general public. The second reason is instrumental, and we heard some of this, I think, in some of the policy statements I put up earlier, which is, well, the public might react against it, so we better involve them in a process and try to convince them. This is basically the convincing point we talked about earlier. It's not about really giving them a say, it's about informing them, this is what we have decided, and you better go along with it, and we tell you why this is a great idea. And this is really instrumental in the sense that it tries to prevent this kind of public backlash, the NIMBY syndrome, not in my backyard, no, we don't want this facility near here, no, we don't want mining operations here. But it can also be to particular policy instruments. For example, we talked about carbon taxation earlier, and obviously that's very controversial, not only in Canada. But then I think the third distinct rationale one can have for public engagement is a more substantive one. So this is really about helping government to take better decisions. And the idea is here that you might be able to get an input on the desirable direction of energy policy and the way we develop our energy system into the future from a broader range of view, not just the usual suspects, draw on different kinds of knowledges, draw on different sets of assumptions, different normative framings of these questions, and that enables a better decision-making process, is the claim. Okay, so these were the sort of three rationales for why one might want to do public engagement. And now I'm straight jumping, because time is short, into two quick examples. One is from the UK and one is from the Netherlands. The UK energy policy for a long time was pretty dormant. Let's say during the Thatcher years, it was the market will do the job. They didn't even have a Ministry of Energy anymore. There was a regulator, obviously, that was important. But other than that, it was pretty much hands-off. The Labour government came in and took a more active stance on energy policy, and in particular was driven by climate change concerns. So in 2003, they published an energy white paper, and, well, the goals are not very surprising. I guess we discussed earlier that sort of on a high level, everyone pretty much agrees with those goals. So it's partly about reducing environmental impact, in particular carbon emissions that the government was concerned at the time. It was about economic efficiency and competition. It was about increasing security of supply, and also access to energy services by the poor, so fuel poverty, which also got mentioned earlier today, I believe. Secondly, there was a big push in this policy document on renewables and new kind of support policies for renewables, as well as energy efficiency, energy savings. So there was published alongside a microgeneration strategy. So there was a focus on small-scale, decentralized solutions to the energy problems. And this is important for my talk here. Nuclear power basically was sidelined. The document bluntly stated, well, nuclear, to be honest, is an unattractive option. No one in the UK had invested in any new or even considered investing in a new nuclear power plant since liberalization. And importantly, the government also said that, well, at the moment this is unattractive. We're not envisaging any investment in this area. We're not going to support anything in this area. But if we were to reconsider, there would be the fullest public consultation. And at the time, this was broadly in line with public opinion. 68% of the people in the UK believed that, well, at least within the next 10 years, there's no need for new nuclear power plants in this country. And there were concerns, and there continue to be concerns about safety, proliferation issues, economic cost of this particular option of electricity generation, and the waste issue was also largely unresolved. While this policy document was drafted, there was a committee on radioactive waste management to give policy recommendations on what is supposed to happen to the nuclear waste of the current fleet of reactors. So pretty much nuclear was ruled out. Yet we shall see that within a very short period of time, just a couple of years, suddenly nuclear came back with a vengeance. And it had to do with a number of factors, but partly it was to do with energy security fears becoming more pronounced, and oil and gas prices being quite unstable in this period, so the quite high price fluctuations, increasing import dependency of the UK, so their own oil and gas activities in the North Sea are coming to an end. And there's also an investment gap in electricity generation. We saw earlier by Sask Power that there are also these projections that, well, in 5 years' time or 6 years' time, probably demand's going to exceed supply. So there's this gap, and we need to fill it somehow. There was also broader international developments. Nuclear was reviving internationally in Asia. Obviously, there were a couple of new plants considered or being constructed, and then Finland took the decision and started building a new reactor as well. This all came together with quite slow deployment of renewable energy. The UK is pretty much talking the talk in terms of renewables, but the policies in this area haven't been very effective, so they have not seen the kind of deployment that we've seen in other European countries such as Denmark or Germany. And so what the government did was they, only 3 years after publishing this energy policy paper that was supposed to be the policy outlook for the next couple of years, published an energy review where they had a consultation on the further direction of energy policy, and suddenly nuclear came in as a very attractive option there. And it was pretty much clear from the outset that this public consultation was just a written kind of exercise, written submissions. The questions were framed in a way that it was pretty clear what the government had decided to do, and that they pretty much had already decided that we need more or new nuclear power stations to replace existing capacity, but also in terms of reducing carbon emissions, also build additional capacity. It was a pretty hasty process. It was done over 12 weeks. People were only given 12 weeks to respond. Of course, it also happened over the summer, so when everyone is on holidays, they expected everyone to come around. And as we've mentioned earlier, the toolbox of public engagement is a lot wider than just say, well, here's a document, we have a couple of questions, there's a 300-page annex, respond within 12 weeks if you have any particular views on this subject, especially for something as complicated as nuclear. But this is what happened. And then, as was expected, the government published a policy called Energy Challenges, in which they didn't really state what really the reason was why suddenly now, 3 years down the line, nuclear was needed. But there was this phrase that nuclear needed to somehow play a key role in plugging this energy gap or this investment gap, which is, in a way, not really believable, since nuclear is sort of the slowest option. If you want to quickly plug a gap, then nuclear power is probably the last thing you want to invest in. But there we go. This was the official pronouncement. And obviously what happened was that this was very contested, and people disagreed. The environmental community got very upset, and the government got taken to court by Greenpeace, because they had promised in the previous policy documents that there would be a fullest consultation if they ever were to reconsider nuclear power. So they took the government to court and won the case. The judge ruled that that was totally inadequate what they did in terms of public consultation, that there was too little information provided in terms of costs, in terms of reasons why nuclear was necessary, in terms of what the alternatives would be, and that little information that was provided was seriously misleading. So that's obviously not a very good example of public engagement. But it got even worse, because then there was this ruling, and the government was very quick to announce, well, we'll have another consultation. At the same time, in the same sentence almost, Prime Minister Blair at the time said, but it's not going to make a difference to our policy at all. And as expected, they did another consultation exercise. It was a bit longer time frame, but not really more substantive. And another energy white paper came out in 2008, strongly supporting nuclear. Some concerns about, well, we can't really directly subsidize nuclear power because of the liberalized market distortion and so on. So the government doesn't pick winners, but we would have some kind of facilitative actions to improve the commercial prospects of nuclear power. So what are we taking from this story? I think that this U-turn in the nuclear policy in the UK was deeply contested by parts of the public, but also by a number of high-profile experts that really couldn't see the need or couldn't really see that nuclear was a feasible option for plugging any sort of short-term gap in capacity. But nevertheless, the government pursued that in a top-down way as part of their strategy in terms of low-carbon transition plan. I'm quickly running out of time, so...
Given you came the furthest, we could probably...
Okay, that's very generous. Thanks very much.
We'll add a minute.
Okay. Okay, so in terms of facilitative action, just very briefly, what they then did was to say, well, we need to streamline permitting and local planning procedures so that people would have less possibilities for opposition to new nuclear power plants, was one of the facilitative actions. The other one was to say, well, why don't we focus on existing sites where we already have communities that are used to having these plants in their backyard, and so whoever wants to build them, please build them where we already have facilities. And the third one was to finance more PhD studentships, for example, building up skills and capacity in the area of nuclear engineering. As I said, the UK hadn't built a nuclear power plant for 25, 30 years, or even longer, so there wasn't really a skills gap as well. So the government is now trying to address this. And then lastly, at the moment there is a ongoing discussion about electricity market reform, so introducing a number of instruments that would somehow help low-carbon generation investment in renewables, in CCS, as well as nuclear. So no direct subsidies, but things like emission performance standards, floor price for a carbon tax is being discussed, as well as capacity payments for new generation capacity that wouldn't run very much. Okay, we have to move on. Quickly, the Dutch example. And the Dutch example is interesting because it took a quite different approach to public engagement. In terms of aims, pretty similar to things we have discussed before. The Dutch government set up this energy transition program in 2000. The aim was a clean, reliable, affordable energy system and reducing carbon emissions by 40 to 60% by 2030 compared to 1990. So quite ambitious carbon reduction targets. This is really what was driving this program. Carbon emission reduction was the key thing. The basic assumption of this whole program, informed by conversation with social science colleagues, was that basically what we're talking about is a transition. It's not just a technological substitution process. It's not just about replacing some kit with some other kit. It's a structural change in the whole way we produce and use energy. It involves technology, it involves infrastructure, but it involves people, behavior, lifestyles, institutional setups, policy frameworks, how the market is organized, and all these things together. And that therefore it involves very many actors and really cannot steer it top down. So the process was then led by the Ministry of Economic Affairs, took charge of this in 2001. And what they did at the heart of this process was public-private platforms, they call them. So they choose certain themes that they thought were important in sustainable energy. So for example, sustainable mobility, sustainable electricity production, chain efficiency, so industrial energy efficiency, and try to bring together people from the public sector, from the private sector, from the research and consulting community, and stakeholder organizations. And they also set up a high-level task force that was controversially led by the CEO of Shell in the Netherlands. And this had a more sort of strategic role in advising on the direction of where this process was going. This is the biofuels example. So as I said, biofuels was or biomass was one of the themes. And this is just a slide to illustrate the sort of process they went through. So they started with this in 2006. They had assembled their stakeholders, so about 12, 15 people from different sectors involved in any of these themes. And then they had this overall vision with these aims in mind that I've just outlined. But then I thought, well, we have to break it down a little bit more and bring the time horizon a little bit nearer for people to imagine what is possible and what is feasible. Maybe 2050 is a bit long. Let's start with 2030 and develop sort of a strategic vision of where we want to be. And what they came up with, this group of stakeholders, that they want biomass to account for 30% of total fuel consumption in 2030, as well as 40% of the sustainably produced electricity, so non-fossil fuel electricity. So that was their strategic vision. And then through a kind of backcasting exercise, they arrived at different transition pathways. So this is trying to imagine, if this is where we want to be in 2030, how are we going to get there? And exploring different routes of getting there. So some people were interested in sustainable production of different kinds of raw materials that can be used in the economy instead of plastics, for example, renewable materials. Some people explored the potential of biofuel production. There was a big discussion about sustainability criteria for biofuel production, because a lot of the biofuel used in the Netherlands is actually imported palm oil from Indonesia, and there were a lot of concerns about biodiversity loss, and so on and so forth. And then people were interested in different conversion technologies, co-firing of biomass in power plants or biogas for electricity generation. And then what they tried to do is to do some experiments, or sometimes there was R&D projects funded by the national R&D budget, or experiments that are sort of more demonstration type projects where different groups of stakeholders come together to experiment with one option that could be part of a solution of a sustainable energy system. Okay, so this was the process. Who was involved? Since we're talking about public engagement. You see some familiar characters, BP, Shell, some of the others you might not know, World Fund for Nature, so an environmental organization. This is also an environmental organization. Nuon is a utility company, so is Essent. Gasunie is the natural gas supply in the Netherlands, a monopoly. TNO is a consulting business. ECN is the Energy Research Center of the Netherlands. So a quite wide range of characters, and in a way the usual suspects you would expect to get involved in this. And this was precisely one of the problems or the questions that people had about this process, that, well, although the government said they would be sort of the transition manager of this process, the government involvement in this was actually quite low. There was usually 1 or 2 people on the platforms, and they were more or less just, well, they were not really contributing to the process. They were more or less observers in this process, and it was really dominated by public sector people, by private sector people, businesses, and there was very little engagement with stakeholder organizations and environmental groups or whatever, and quite a lot of academics involved in it as well. So what does this experience tell us? What effects did it have, this program? And I think it's fair to say that it had quite a substantial impact on energy innovation policy. So in terms of public funding for R&D or innovation activities, deployment activities, there it had an impact. To get funding from the government, you had to fit into one of those transition pathways that were suggested. It's partly informed regular policy in terms of renewable energy policy. But the big problem was that it was criticized for a democratic disconnect. And basically, partly because, for example, as I said, Shell led the task force for this program, was considered as being elite-driven and dominated really by the incumbent energy companies. And there was talk of policy capture, so there was a backlash against this program in this way. And understandably, there was an emphasis, because it was dominated by sort of incumbent energy companies, there was an emphasis on technologies and business opportunities. A lot of the talk I've heard so far today goes into the same direction. This transitions approach, though, was supposed to be a lot wider and was also supposed to pay attention to the social, the political, or the behavioral challenges. And that got a little bit sidelined because of the involvement of this particular cast of characters. There was, for example, no platform, and for example, what would 80% lower carbon lifestyle look like? It was pretty much supply-driven. Now, looking at energy policy in the Netherlands, there's major public acceptability issues around nuclear power. While this process was going on, the Prime Minister announced, or the Energy Minister at the time announced, we're going to extend the lifetime of our existing nuclear power plant. Now there's a new pronouncement. They were actually considering building new nuclear power plant. Also deeply contested, wasn't part of this process at all. Nuclear just wasn't on the agenda. It was all about renewables, sustainable mobility, other things. Nuclear was not part of the process. Same is true for CCS. Now the huge backlash, a project got cancelled for a demonstration project on onshore CCS storage. Also didn't happen because of public backlash against it. Again, CCS wasn't part of the program. So what they did was they basically left the most controversial issues off this agenda. And I think the people who set up this program really believed that structural change in the energy system can only come about through wider societal engagement and support, and are therefore quite pessimistic about this initiative achieving its goals. Okay, last slide. So what can we learn from these examples of public engagement and public acceptance? I think there are a number of cases. Both highlight that it is important to engage the public in energy policy. Otherwise, you face these kind of public reactions and backlashes against decisions down the line. What they also show, both in their own ways, that it's quite difficult to achieve meaningful public engagement. The UK example being particularly bad at that, but also in the Dutch way, in a way that was a quite inspiring model of how to engage the public with this kind of scenario building, backcasting type exercise. I think there is quite an interesting model for how to engage stakeholders in a meaningful way, but it also then showed how even a good idea is quite problematic in its implementation or quite difficult to do well. And I think what we can learn from this is that public engagement, basically, it's partly about the process. So if you tell people at the point you publish the consultation that it's not going to change what the government will do about it, that's not a great incentive. So it's partly about process. It's partly about the actors, so who's involved in it. There is a crucial point with the Dutch experience that if you sort of engage, or if you're seen to only engage incumbent actors, that's a big roadblock. And then thirdly, also the substance matters. There's no point in having a discussion about what's the vision for sustainable energy system and then have certain options not on the table to discuss. Nuclear, CCS, whatever they might be, biofuels. And I think in this context, it's particularly important to acknowledge that this rhetoric of there is no alternative, TINA as we call it, is really unhelpful. And I'm very much in favor of what my colleague said earlier, that it is important that we acknowledge that there are choices, that there are lots of different possibilities, and we put them on the table and discuss them in a meaningful way. And the last point, I was almost going to withdraw from the slide listening to the discussion, because it appeared to me that that might be a very UK-specific point, but I'll share it with you anyways. And this is there a pretty difficult dilemma? And this is how we see it in the UK, with very ambitious government targets. The UK government wants to reduce CO2 emissions by 2050 by 80%. And so the question is, if that's the scale of the ambition, we need to do right. We need to start right now, and we need to do lots of things. And public engagement normally needs time. So there's this trade-off between, well, on the one hand, there's this urgency of the problem. We really need to get going now. We really need to do something now. And on the other hand, well, we can only do that if we build legitimacy around this process. If we fail to do so, there's going to be public backlash, and we're not going to get there. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris, Linda, and Florian for 3 excellent presentations. And even though Florian went a little over, I think it was worth the extra time. It just cut into coffee break, so on the balance, it was far more significant to hear him. So the microphone is over here. If there's any questions or comments, please identify yourself by name and your organization so we can keep it for the record.
I'm Doug Sovereign, SRC. I guess the question I have is, how do you have public engagement and make it fair? Like it always seems to me the process seems to get hijacked by one side or the other. And really, I think when it gets hijacked, that shows a disrespect for the public's ability to really understand the issues. And I think the public can understand complex issues, and people forget that. They just want to hijack the whole process, either on one side or the other. Like, how do you build a fair, I mean, I'm sure Mr. Perrins has a fair opinion about that too. Like, how do you make the process fair?
So today I just get to moderate, and my 3 friends get to answer.
That's not fair.
So I would just take turns.
Sure. I could certainly start on that. And the first question I would have back, fairness in according to who? There's difference of opinions of what fair is and what fair isn't. The process that we went through in the future of uranium in Saskatchewan, there was a lot of people who went to that process, and as you noted, there was a great deal of debate, heated debate, emotional debate. And yes, there were advocacy groups there that certainly dominated. And that was unfair to some of those, including just John and Jane Q. Public, who just wanted to be there and hear things and wanted to get up and ask legitimate questions. We heard that quite a bit. But in fairness in the eyes of the general public is an interesting question. They saw the process, at least that part of the process, which is just town hall meetings, as possibly being not terribly fair. That's why you have to do many different types of engagement. Town hall, we talked about it. Do we need to do that? Do we have to do that? Is there other ways to get the same kinds of opinions and input that you get from town halls? And there are other ways, but yeah, we have to. We have to go out, put down which was the Uranium Development Partnership in front of people, and get that input straight from the people who attended those meetings. So we had to go ahead and do those. But there was lots of other ways for people to engage. They could go online. There was a workshop, an online workbook. You could write a letter. You could step up and be part of the stakeholder one-on-one consultations. So there was a lot of different other ways, if you didn't think that the town halls were fair, that you could have input. So it's a matter of getting as many of those tools I talked about employed as possible so that everybody has an opportunity to have input.
I agree with Chris totally, but I would just add that, Farn talked about the issue of time, and I think that time, doing adequate planning and planning these multifaceted ways of doing things, but having the time and support of, if it's for the government or whatever, have the opportunity to kind of backtrack a bit and not have such tight deadlines that you can't sort of say, this just didn't kind of work out in here. And having done market research, and I'm sure Chris could say, sometimes you ask a question. I did a lot of work in Africa, and I did my best to try to figure out what were the right questions. But, we had to go back into the field, in a real sense of a field, and get more data and try to figure out what went wrong there. Why did we not get some of the answers that we thought? So I think, having the tyranny of sometimes a deadline. The other thing that I've never seen, and maybe it exists, but I've never seen people actually in these multi-forum, when you do something like the market research, put out all that information in terms of the questions and the results and the data. Like just, like communicate, just do it. That's what I said about being fair to people, about giving them the respect of feedback. And so often we don't respect people. And we do hidden government polls, or we do, things like that, and then we busily use that and say, well, I mean, if you're going to do the poll, especially in a place like Saskatchewan where people know more stuff that's going on, understand you're going to have to release it, and be prepared to, suck it up in terms of what happens. But I think I'm kind of more of a open the kimono type, like just go for it in this day and age and get on with it and be prepared for all of that. But I agree totally with Chris about all the other aspects you've raised.
And just one quick comment on that. In Saskatchewan, if the government does a poll, it has to be released publicly by law.
No, I agree very much with my two colleagues on the kind of procedural issues, and it's important to have different kinds of, different forms of engagement and use them simultaneously to address the same issue. But it is true that it is difficult to get public engagement right, and I think both of my examples showed that. One thing that I would like to mention, though, is public engagement, I think, is more robust and more meaningful if it takes the form of deliberative procedures. Workshops with stakeholders, scenario building exercises. One of my colleagues, for example, has developed a tool called multi-criteria mapping, where people can think about what does it mean to have a sustainable energy system, what kind of criteria would we want to use for that, but then not to aggregate their views and values, but to separate it out and say, well, individual people you have to have one list, but then people can weigh the criteria differently. Maybe economic cost is for some people the most important thing, and then they can rate that very highly, and other people feel that the environmental consequences are the most important issue for them. So by giving people the opportunities to weigh those criteria, and by not aggregating then this information back into one number, like cost-benefit analysis would do, but by keeping that open and providing this information to policymakers, and then hold policymakers accountable for the kinds of decision they draw on the basis of this, I think is the way to go. Being transparent about that, acknowledging that there were those value differences between people that were engaged in the discussions, and not trying to come to some kind of consensus on the lowest common denominator, I think is important.
But if you're dealing with anyone like my stepson at 25, there's not going to be much deliberation. I mean, they're just inundated with information, and they want to have input and whatever, and getting to them is sometimes a real issue, and we even find that politically in our country in terms of people voting as well.
Dwayne?
Good afternoon. Dwayne Bratt from Mount Royal University in Calgary. This question is largely aimed at Chris, but I'd like to hear Linda and Florian chime in. Chris, you touched on this a bit in your presentation, but I just want to push it a bit further about how policymakers balance the results that come out of public consultation with what I would call sort of the economic and technological realities that may, in fact, contradict. And you look at the situation in Ontario, where there is support for natural gas unless you try building a plant in Oakville. Yeah. Where there was backlash against building new nuclear in Darlington at the public hearings there, where there was great support for wind power until you try building wind turbines in Lake Ontario, where there is strong support for shutting down coal plants, but as long as the lights come on and your price of electricity is quite low. So how do you balance these out and at the same time have the public say, you're not listening to us, we don't want these things, but we want clean, cheap electricity? How do you balance those things out?
Well,
that's an easy one.
Yeah, that's why I'm not a decision maker. I give them the information for them to make. No, those are very difficult questions, and you hit a couple of issues right on the head, and that is there's a difference between provincial opinions and regional opinions. We came across that a little bit in the future of uranium in Saskatchewan, where there was some interest from some Northern First Nations community about potentially maybe looking at somewhere in the future about nuclear storage. And that met with great opposition provincially. Now, who should, and these are communities that are have serious economic development issues and cultural or social economic issues that could basically write their ticket for generations if they were to indeed land something like that in their communities. And yet, provincially, the sentiment is no, not in the province. So whose opinion should weigh more so, and which of those particular opinions should hold more sway? And that's a difficult one. That's why they're decision makers. That's why they get elected. But it's our role to get that in front of them. Here's what we found. Here's what was said. And so you're going to get the NIMBY. You're going to get that regional opposition or regional support and provincial opposition. It's a tough question. I don't think I have the right answer. How do you weigh that?
And I just would like to add one thing that I found during, Dwayne, after the blackout, when the blackout took place in Eastern Canada, and we were faced with the fact that particularly some of the nuclear plants had to go down and they couldn't come back up really fast. And what we found out, because we got abuse, lots of abuse and whatever, is it's almost an opportunity to find out what are the misinformation that people have about technology. It's like people think that milk comes from the grocery store, not a cow. It was almost the same thing that, because so many of us are deeply engaged in these things, we don't even know the questions. We don't know what they don't know sometimes. And you find out through opportunities like that are awful. But you find out things like, they actually thought that they just plugged it into the, to the wall. Or they also really didn't understand in the NIMBY problem how the loss, transmitting from long distances. So the answer, usually in Ontario, and a friend of mine is an executive with Oakville Hydro, that they found out that people really thought that the idea was to move it all up to the Bruce Peninsula, which would be equivalent to La Ronge or something, and then let's build all of it way up somewhere where you can't see it, and then just transport it down. So it really offered, I don't know what they did with it, but we gave the policymakers the opportunity to say, look at, when you dig down behind why they think these things, there's some basic misinformation that we fail to do. That's why I talked a little bit about moving energy into the schools. That I think that we really have to start engaging people in understanding these things. And I'm agreeing about the complexity. They can if you've educated kids, more. So that's the only. I'm being a ready optimist here, but I don't know if you have a.
Yeah, can I just take up one strand that Linda mentioned, and this is about, and also it was part of the question in terms of economic and technological realities, and then the point about misinformation and what is real information. And I think Chris already mentioned that there's a thin line between correcting misinformation in the general public and sort of propaganda, and of course nuclear power, perfectly safe, and then we see things happening that maybe people didn't want to see. So I think there is a thin line. And I think James discussed this eloquently earlier when he was asked about what's a sustainable energy system. And on a broad level, we all agree, but then when it comes down to the detail, people disagree. And it is a normative question. So I don't think there is, in that sense, misinformation. There is differences in values. Do I care more about my local visual impact of a wind turbine in front of my house, or do I care about long-term climate change effects that might happen elsewhere, let's say Bangladesh? So these are value judgments. These are ethical judgments. These are partly about future generations. And so I don't think in that sense that we can agree or that there is right information and misinformation. And so that comes back to what I said earlier in terms of decision-making. Then what we need is honest accounts of these dilemmas, plural policy advice. And at the end of the day, it's the policymakers who will have to take decisions based on the information and other considerations they have, and they will need to be accountable for that to the general public. I think that would be my answer.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have to say the 3 presentations this afternoon.
Tell us who you are.
Oh,
We know
I'm
who
Sandra
you are.
Morin, sorry. I'm Sandra Morin, the NDP Environment Critic. The presentations this afternoon were outstanding, very good. And Florian, I would have to say that your presentation and the depth of it and the fact that it ran over time is quite all right. I would like to see it mandatory for every elected official and every ministry official to have to sit through your presentation because it was that good. Having said that, we went through a process in Saskatchewan, which I know some feel was hijacked. But there was a mandate that was set out, and that mandate was stuck to in terms of Mr. Perrin's application of that mandate. But the mandate was around uranium development. And unfortunately, a lot of people wanted to see something much broader. They wanted to see a full debate on all energy options that could be pursued in Saskatchewan in terms of the energy future of Saskatchewan. So I think we've learned a lot this afternoon in terms of how we can move forward with energy policy Saskatchewan. And having given the advice that we've seen from Florian today, it's especially important, as you said, to be fully accountable and lay out all the options and be honest about what those options are, and then perhaps we can avoid some of the problems that we've encountered in the past. I'm just wondering if anyone sees any way of correcting the how should I say, the sentiment that we now feel in Saskatchewan in terms of the mistrust and doubt as to what is going to be the future of the energy policy going forward for Saskatchewan. Does anybody have any opinions on that?
Probably good if Florian did.
Yeah, you're the blue-eyed boy now.
Well, he's also from away, as they say.
I think it's interesting. I'm working on CCS policy in the UK at the moment, and I think it is interesting that whenever people look into public acceptability of CCS, it's quite different in different countries. In, let's say, Norway, more accepted than in the Netherlands or the UK. But I think what is a generic finding of all these studies is that if you describe CCS as part of a broader mix of options, as a package, not as the single technical fix to the problem, people accept it a lot more. So I think that goes back to what you were saying about putting all the options on the table, and maybe the uranium development issue as it was framed too narrowly. We've had a similar case in the UK. I mentioned this commission on the radioactive waste management in the UK and exploring different options for radioactive waste management. And Gordon McCarran, the director of SPRU, was chairing that committee. And there, the issue was also rising in terms of, are we talking about, and the committee made it very clear that their task was to explore what is supposed to happen to the existing liabilities, the waste we have already produced, and that the ethical issues of producing more nuclear waste by building another fleet of reactors is quite different from the legacy that we effectively have to deal with in some way. And I think these kind of distinction, being open about them and consulting the public on them and have a broader engagement are important to gaining this kind of trust you're talking about. How exactly to do that in Saskatchewan, I'm not sure. I've only been here since last night, 7 o'clock.
I would just simply add that you're absolutely correct. The mandate of the UDP and the subsequent future of uranium in Saskatchewan was about the value-added industry of the nuclear product in Saskatchewan. It looked at 5 different areas, which was nuclear storage, nuclear power production, exploration and mining, processing and refinement, research and development. That was the 5 areas, because the whole purpose behind the UDP was to say that we've gone a long way in producing value added in this province on most of our resources except for uranium, which we just ship out. Their task was, how can we get that value added in Saskatchewan for economic development reasons? They came up with 20 recommendations. So that's what went forward in terms of the future of uranium in Saskatchewan, and it was narrowly focused on that. There's also, and that's well accepted. There's also a thought here, though, that you could also get too broad. Can you imagine how difficult and complex nuclear is? Now you start adding in cogeneration, clean coal, wind, hydro, biomass. How broad do you get before you become too shallow in discussions with the public? So it's a bit of a balance, and it's a difficult balance as we move forward on an integrated policy for Saskatchewan.
I wouldn't necessarily comment on Saskatchewan because I, don't know what the dilemmas are here in terms of where the policy is. I just would say, as a former regulator, what I found is when people get quite frustrated, and that's because they think other people are hijacking it or they don't get heard, that it's because the opportunities are too narrow. And I can only speak for the CNSC, but I think other regulators face this problem. I know probably the Energy Board had this issue too. How do you help ordinary people to have their voice without spending 6 months on something? But in general, a lot of the discussions, and you talked about the Dutch experience, tend to get very much into stakeholders who are industry stakeholders or the usual. So I think it's better planning up front and trying to look at this more broadly and actually using poor consultation as a risk. Poor consultation is a major risk. So don't concentrate just on the subject, but also concentrate on what have you learned and not learned from the past ones about how your citizens want to get engaged, and how could you, without looking for perfection, how could you make it better? And this constant learning on the process, as well as constant learning on the subject matter, if I could put it that way, because but realizing that I think that those are indicator organisms, if I can be a chemist for a minute. When people feel either that it's been hijacked or they haven't had involvement, you may have to go back and relook at how you're doing things, and be prepared to be embarrassed about the fact that you haven't maybe done it right, which we don't like to do.
Probably have time for one more question, because it's coffee break, so. Well, it's been a long time since I've sat and not said anything about an issue I've been involved in. So I really enjoyed. I wish I would have had some of the benefit of the expertise shown, demonstrated today before I set off. I do have to. I've been involved in developing group homes in neighborhoods that don't want them. I've been involved in small hospital closures where the community didn't want that, and the contentious issue around the value added for uranium. And it just couldn't help but think of some of those experiences, that it's when it really touches people directly. I didn't have to worry when we were engaging people in the group home discussion in the neighborhoods where the group homes were going to be, nor in those communities where the hospitals were. They came out in full force. Some of the communities around the small hospital changes, everybody in the town came, much to our dismay. So I think when it touches people is I think the sense I'd get, and that comes through hard work, because a lot of discussion about the process around, and Dwayne did a nice job of describing it in another session earlier today about the consultation. I think, though, the recommendations were what I found most useful, and one of them, I was really pleased to hear Florian say almost word for word what was in it, was that you can't have the conversation unless all the options are made available to the public. And that to me, whatever, in the theme of today, if that's not part of the exercise, then we're very shortchanged. So, but I really want to thank the panelists. I think they did an excellent job. Thank you.